Welcome to the review of OH&S compliance to relevant legislation of Inner Perth City Cafe. This presentation has been formatted for presentation to both owners and academia and will include background details of the cafe, findings from the interview of the cafe owners, the applicable OH&S legislation in Western Australia, the applicable industry legislation, in this case predominantly the food handling industry. We will also examine the penalties of non-conformance. We'll also visit findings from the OH&S audit and inspection carried out in the premises and document review, from which recommendations will be discussed, followed by a concluding statement. An informal meeting was held at the cafe with Pat, as well as a document review with both Pat and Mel at their home, so as to ensure both visual inspection, audit completion and documentation could be evaluated. They advised their main focus had been on renovating the cafe. It was run down and looking to expand its customer base. Initially, they reviewed staff performance and made some changes to ensure coverage and additional skill sets were accounted for. Due to their investment, they've been focused on increasing revenue and not paid enough attention to OH&S compliance, and know they're lacking in several areas. Hopefully this presentation and subsequent audit review can assist them in furthering their OH&S knowledge and compliance, which they are keen to do. This slide demonstrates the relevant legislation and its relationship as it applies to Western Australia. Whilst we will go into more detail in relation to the industry-specific legislation shown in relation to food retail businesses, the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1984 and Occupational Safety and Health Regulations of 1996 remain the two major legislative compliance requirements in Western Australia. Being defined as a food business under the Food Act 2008, there is greater emphasis placed on this Act in relation to OH&S compliance of this business. The Food Regulations 2009 mainly refers to food manufacture with emphasis on meat production and has really little relevance in the operation of the cafe. The cafe also comes under the jurisdiction of the City of the Perth Council, which basically references the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Codes as the underlying set of legal principles and guidance to be followed. There are also relevant Australian standards as quoted in the audit form to be considered, as well as industry guidance notes. There are a few relevant codes of practices, but essentially the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Codes provides the greatest source of information in relation to ensuring OH&S compliance. This presentation is not designed to overwhelm you with every legal aspect of the business, only the most relevant. The Health Act of 1911 and 30 plus odd Australian standards in relation to equipment, lighting and machine guarding, for example, have not been included, but rather be assessed in planned risk assessment to be undertaken at a later date. The respective sections of the Food Act 2008 shown here are an example of some of the penalties that can be enforced for the relevant breaches of the Act. As shown, the financial costs involved in non-compliance is quite considerable, as we'll go through in the next slide as well. Other non-compliance considerations can involve costs in public liability and workers' compensation should customers or staff suffer an injury or illness, and subsequent loss of patronage and reputation from the above. The increased scrutiny of authorities as inspectors tend to go hard on poor performing businesses, as you'll also see in the next slide. Registrations and licences can be jeopardised if the cafe continues to not reach and or maintain OH&S standards. Inefficient and unsafe work practices that are not assessed and managed can also lead to staff morale declining due to uncaring management, uncomfortable work environment, and failure to ensure their self-welfare. And these are just a few examples of what can happen with non-conformance. Convictions so far this year alone in 2014 are considerable, and as highlighted, the fines can be crippling to any small business. This is a publicly advertised list with links to notification of convictions as shown. I'd suggest in an effort to name and shame. And this remains on the main Department of Health WA website for 24 months from the time of conviction. This is not the kind of advertisement and reputation any cafe business would like to see, and another reason OHS compliance is a high business priority. Also, now I know where to find it, I'll be checking this list before I book my next restaurant. To help evaluate the current level of OH&S compliance, a basic compliance audit was undertaken using the audit form from the WorkSafe WA OH&S in Restaurants newsletter, which was then modified to include the respective acts, regulations, standards, and guidance notes. The newsletter also advises that this is the same checklist used by the inspectors. As the Food Act of 2008 references the Australian New Zealand Food Code in relation to the majority of items outlined within this audit, they were used for the reference. As will be discussed later, this was not an all-encompassing audit, and it requires a risk assessment of the cafe and its operations to be conducted first before a more in-depth audit can be undertaken. This slide demonstrates the sample of the complete audit to understand its scope and the process of compiling and finding recommendations. When looking at some of the examples of non-compliance during the OH&S review, issues such as chemical storage, no MSDS registers, they all need to be improved. The storage of gas bottles used in the patio heaters really need to be put into an area away from the public. The first aid kit in the public work are not compliant. Blue band-aids and more accessible area needs to be considered. The use of ladders and storage of heavier items at lower levels within the kitchen storage areas needs to be improved. The use of double adapters and floorboards are not really an acceptable practice. The main electrical switchboard had its access blocked by the table and the door closed. It probably needs a bit better lighting in there. And at the front, there's a trip hazard as you come into the cafe. It's probably only 20 or 30 mils tall, but it's certainly enough that could cause a problem later on. After looking at a sample of some of the negative findings, it's also prudent to take a look at some of the compliance issues that were of a good standard. The kitchen area, whilst being confined in nature, is well laid out with minimal manual handling issues. The size is not ideal, but it's certainly workable. The license approvals, evacuation plans, etc. were well displayed and constructed. Whilst we won't delve too much into the bar side of the business, which is still in its infancy, training records and staff training and responsible serving of alcohol was good. Fire extinguishers, the fire blanket and emergency procedures were well displayed and up to date. The seating areas were well kept, the furniture was in good condition, and on top of it all, the coffee and the food were absolutely delicious and the wait staff were excellent. With evaluating the audit findings and ensuring headway is made in relation to OH&S compliance, I'd like to make the following recommendations. It's not an exhaustive list as been discussed with Pat, but at least a good starting point. We need to complete a risk assessment for the cafe and its operations to get a more detailed understanding of the current compliance. And as pointed out in the Occupational Health and Safety Act of 1984, it is also a legal requirement. Additional safety signage in the kitchen and serve areas to assist and remind staff will be a welcome addition and is an immediate visual display of OH&S commitment. A formal health, safety, environment management system needs to be established so all management and staff have clear guidelines so as to assist in their roles and responsibilities, from position descriptions right through to assessing risks and auditing the system, etc. Training, induction activities and record keeping needs to be investigated and improved. There's a lot of short online courses in food handling that are available on the internet and could be a worthwhile investment. And copies of HSE documentation needs to be on site and available at all times. In conclusion, there is a considerable amount of legislation to dissect, understand and comply within the food handling, restaurant and cafe business. Only the main ones have been presented in this presentation. And considering the small size of most of these businesses, it's not hard to conclude that many don't comply fully, as well as understanding their requirements or actually view this as a business priority. The costs have been demonstrated in this presentation of non-compliance, be it financial or otherwise, has to be considered. And there's also a cost of ensuring this compliance, and this needs to be considered the cost of doing business and incorporated into their business plan. As discussed with both Pat and Mel when reviewing the full audit findings, further assistance in risk assessing and developing a robust health, safety, environment management system for the cafe will be taking place, and I'll hope to assist with that in the future. The cafe this presentation is sought to review has the foundations of not only a thriving business model, but one capable considering the owner's commitment of being the outstanding example in respect of OH&S compliance. I'd like to thank the owners and members of the staff we interviewed during this process for their time and cooperation, and hopefully this presentation has been a useful tool in relation to their business activities.